Now, due to tensions with Israel, Jordan accused Egypt of basically just doing nothing to help Jordan and to defend Jordan and so on and so forth. And Egypt was promoting itself as the champion of the Arabic world, that it was the defender of the Arabic world and the lead nation. So this plus the pressure from the populations, it caused Nasser to make some symbolic gestures of support. There's also a curious tale that the Soviet Union apparently told Nasser, for some reasons which are completely unknown to historians, we don't know why, that Israel was amassing an army along the border of Syria, as well as potentially with Egypt. So what Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's the president of the very charismatic Egyptian president at the time, he begins massing troops on the border with Israel. Now, the troops are nowhere near an invasion force. Intelligence reports at the time, even the Mossad reports and others, all acknowledge the same thing, which is that this is a show of strength. It's just to rattle sabers. It's not an invasion force at all whatsoever. The Israelis were unconcerned by that. But also he closed the Straits of Tiran, which is where shipping comes from to South Israel by the port city of Eilat. Now, that was, Egypt was in a situation where it had to at least show some indignation and rattle sabers to say that we are doing something. Look, we're making these gestures to tell Israel that, don't do it again. But Israel used this as an opportunity to, in essence, strike first against. Well, they strike first. They call it striking first, but there was never striking first. Implies that the other side were actually ever going to strike, but rather to just strike against Egypt, against Syria, and so on. And it began a bombing campaign, which caught the Egyptian Air Force unaware on the ground, destroyed them. It caught the Egyptian army by surprise because they weren't expecting any fighting, because they weren't going to do any fighting. And this led to a rapid ground advance by the Israeli army, which led to them controlling and taking over all of the Sinai in 6 days. So, and it's not the first time they took it back. That's where they took it. They took it in 1956, but this is them taking it again, and we have to wait for Egypt to take it back in the subsequent war. So this is the infamous 6 Days Wars, because they also took the Golan Heights. Now, as with Jordan, Jordan had placed their army under the control of an Egyptian general under a United Arab Defense Pact. There's a long story which I won't get into, but the King Abdullah was reticent to join in the fighting or what have you. I think he just tokenly fired some artillery shots into Israel, seeing that Israel is fighting Egypt and Syria, and Israel uses as a pretext to invade the West Bank. This is where the West Bank gets invaded. The Israelis. Again, this map shows you the conquest of the Golan Heights by the Israeli forces in the north against Syria. Again, Syria was not launching any invasion army. Jordan wasn't launching any invasion army, and the Egyptians were not launching any invasion army. This is a war initiated by Israel, and even admitted by such that it was initiated. It wasn't a war of defense by subsequent Israeli presence, which we can get into in the next session. Okay, so Israel took over these conquests in the bright green here. It signaled that it might return these lands in return for peace. So it might return Golan Heights back to Syria in return for peace. It might return Sinai back to Egypt in return for peace. But as some of the years went by, just a few years went by, and when Gamal Abdel Nasser signaled the possibility of actually taking up on that offer, the Israeli military and now under Golda Meir, who is now the prime minister, was actually quite overconfident, thinking, well, you know what, our military is actually pretty unbeaten. We'll just keep it. They actually didn't want to talk about it. Actually, no, you know what? We want to come to that at the moment. We're kind of happy with what we've taken, because they've increased Israel's size multiple fold now. I mean, Sinai is mostly wasteland, but it can always be developed. At this time, Israel then took the municipality of East Jerusalem. So in the previous war, in 1948, the Zionists took over West Jerusalem, and they held on to that. But East Jerusalem was taken by the Jordanians as part of the West Bank. And here they incorporate it into the municipality of Jerusalem in total as a united Jerusalem municipality. Now, the West Bank was never offered to Jordan back, saying, we'll give it back to you in return for peace. That was never offered to Jordan. So clearly they treat the West Bank rather differently than they treated the other territories. Now, the 1967 aftermath, it led to the three no's, the infamous three no's, by the Khartoum resolution, where the Arab League didn't want to actually give Israel formal recognition or peace, and were very outraged at. So after the war, the Arab states were indignant at having their land conquered and taken over by Israeli state, and they weren't in the mood to negotiate, and they came up at the Khartoum conference with the Khartoum resolution, the three no's: no peace to Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Now, at this time, there was only some good news for some Palestinians, which was the Palestinians in what is within the Green Line, armistice lines, or Israel proper, quote unquote, according to the UN, they had actually been living under military rule for almost 20 years, since 1948. So that 20% minority of Palestinians which hadn't been expelled or killed or massacred were actually living under a different set of laws and rules than the other citizens of that state. So I know many Zionists like to say that they treat they're called the Israeli Arabs. They treat the Israeli Arabs as equal citizens, but for the first 20 years of their existence within the Israeli state, they were under military law and martial rule. Only after the Six-Day War were they actually given, I suppose, full civil rights, which was different to what they'd been living under for 20 years. So after they'd been chewed up by 20 years of martial law and rule, they were allowed to be equal citizens in a civil sense. So their life improved a bit because they were allowed to be given full rights. So Israel, buoyed by its success and feeling itself invincible, probably felt like it could give them rights now. It felt like, okay, they're not threat anymore. There was also another major turning point in this war, which was that prior to this, the majority of religious Jews around the world arguably didn't have expressed much support or enthusiasm for Israel. Many of them still disagreed with the notion of an Israeli nation state when it was believed by them that they must wait for the Messiah to come and establish the state for Jews, a state based on Mosaic law, a kingdom of God, not a nation state based with secular laws and liberal or socialist political policies. But this changed. It was viewed that Israel had divine favor by winning in 6 days, beating all the local regimes around it. And so this saw a sea change in support from many religious Jews around the world. And this began to then affect the demographics of support amongst Jews for Israel, even within Israel. And we saw that in the West Bank, which was newly conquered, the beginning of religious Jews venturing out and establishing settlements in the West Bank, which we now know today as obviously breaking international law.